I'm not sure I've ever heard that song before, but I am still Samuel Trapp. This is still Damn Radio, and you are listening to International Flavor. And today's show is coming to you live from the real state of the art studio in Lake Ozark, Missouri. That's right. Feel free to call in this evening if you'd like. 573-746-8020. I have the esteemed position, the much sought after position of being the first show of the week. So, well, I suppose I could be the last show of the week. Oh my gosh, I guess it depends on how I wish to look at it. If I wish to look at it as the last show of the week, I just say Sunday's the last day of the week. And if I choose to be the first, I just say Sunday is the first day of the week. And I am either the last or the first. I'm getting a brain cramp just thinking that way. So I hope it doesn't hurt too much because it's starting to be rather painful. So I think I'm going to give up on that whole line of reasoning and just give it up completely. But today I wanted to talk about, and I've been doing a little bit of reflection, soul searching, however you want to talk about it, on the judicial branch. And everybody knows my thoughts on, everybody that listens anyway, knows my thoughts on the legal profession, on corruption, which is rampant in our government in general. And you would like to think that the judicial branch is above such things. But in point of fact, it really isn't. And so I thought today we might go into a little bit of history regarding that scenario and chat a little bit about it and see what kind of alternatives are out there stewing and brewing, and check out some other periods in history that were of the United States that were a little less than stellar from the judicial point of view, and then compare Missouri to the federal system. I've had a little bit of entertainment doing that, but before I got to that, I wanted to go over a tiny bit of international news because there's something that's just been bugging me lately because it isn't reported in the U.S. at all. And they just ignore it. Everywhere you go, it's ignored. That the progress of the Russian military machine in Ukraine. And what they have started to do is Zelensky has thrown out some things about how the West and Trump are ignoring Russia's attacks on Ukraine because they're bombing the crap out of them. Now, this is a fairly recent development, okay? Now, Ukraine, on the other hand, has been, first of all through the alleged ceasefires, they ignored all of that, and then Russia held the line and didn't breach the ceasefires. We've talked about this before. We're on, I believe it was April 18 or April 14, whatever the day was, a 30-day ceasefire from energy infrastructure took place, and Ukraine ignored it repeatedly, several hundred times, and Russia did not. And then now they have finished today. Today they announced after the first Istanbul meeting, Russia is due after, and they've said, after we exchange our 1,000 prisoners, we engage in what we agreed upon in Istanbul, then we will give you a detailed assessment toward the end of this conflict. We don't want a ceasefire. We want an end to the conflict. And in order to do that, we have to look at the root causes. So I don't anticipate that there's going to be anything there. Some big paper, another economist, a Wall Street Journal, who knows? I really don't recall. But I read an article today that they said that Russia is failing. The Russian military is not succeeding, basically. And then on the other hand, they say that they are. So it depends on who you listen to, whether they are or they aren't. But basically, if you just wait Russia out another year, then Russia will fail on their own. They say they're. I saw an article today said they were losing 1,000 to 1,500 a day. I don't believe that, but that's what they say. Russia is creating a buffer zone in the north in the Sumy region, wherever it starts in Bryansk and Kursk and in Belgorod, which are the so in the Kiev northeast there's Kharkov and then there's Sumy. And so Russia, and Putin was pretty blunt and upfront about it the other day, said we're going to create buffer zones in these areas, and they're busy taking Sumy region, and the Ukrainians have finally acknowledged it. That, oh gee, we're not in Kursk anymore, because remember, for several weeks they're trying to say they're still there. And also they're openly saying that this is going to become Trump's failure. So this is the narrative that they're already pushing, and I've said this for a few weeks now, that the whole thing is going to be to blame the Ukraine loss on Donald Trump when we refuse, hopefully, to give them more money, refuse, hopefully, to give them more weapons. We need to be out of this. And we don't need to be supplying these things. Anyway, I think it is unfortunate that people don't review the realities of life, and Russia taking over a few villages, small towns, basically every day. They're taking a couple and running them off. But if that was the case, then how could the same newspaper say that Russia is going to implode on its own within a year? It's not the case. There's a U.S. soldier who's been over there. I think I talked about him on Thursday night a little bit, but I honestly don't recall that he was talking about they are having no problems getting R&R, taking 30 days off, to refresh, regroup, and come back. And they have plenty of chances for relaxation. The Ukrainian soldiers don't have that opportunity. So I ask you to caution anything you hear on the West here, especially if it comes from any of the big networks, because it ain't true. Get on Telegram, watch yourself, and see what they do. And if you are interested in it was Washington Post, by the way, that said Russia is weakening on its own. I don't believe it at all, nor should anybody else, on what they are attempting to put out. It's complete nonsense and shouldn't be believed in that fashion. At any rate, if you want to see something, look for, there was an interesting one I saw on Alex Christoforou on YouTube channel, and Alex was talking about the return of Boris Johnson, Bojo. That was kind of the high point for me. The funny part of his show, bringing back Boris Johnson. Can you imagine that? He would be the guy to go. So just in time, and this was his comment, not mine. I stole it. Where he said just in time for round 2 of Istanbul, or round 3, depending on how you look at it, of Istanbul. Here we have Boris Johnson maybe throwing his hat back in the ring in England, British politics and trying to get back involved in it just in time to throw the kibosh on any new agreement that the parties can come up with. But I don't know. There's a huge Russian offensive beginning. Most people, most sane people, think that there's a large counteroffensive. This is the time for the counteroffensive. The rains are done. The ground is hardened. Russia can now go, and they're bombing the crap out of Kiev. But I say what they're doing is giving I don't want to call it a measured response, but I think they're measuring it. So last night, Kiev sent 100, 110, 140, something like that, drones to Moscow. Okay. And Russia takes most of them out. You know, some of them hit their targets, but very few. Russia has plenty of air defense capability. On the other hand, what Russia has started doing is mirroring, like Kiev will throw out 500 drones. Russia will throw out 100 missiles and 400 drones. You know, they're starting to measure. I've noticed that they're starting to report the next day almost the same amount that Kiev is sending their way. All this in ramping up toward where you're going to go with alleged peace talks. I don't know. But keep an eye on that. We'll talk more about that this week as we come up. Again, before I get into my judicial review of things, I wanted to talk about that. Interesting. And then on the funny side, I watched there's a lady I like to watch. She's Ukrainian. She's basically been exiled she lives in Russia or Belarus, don't remember, but no longer in Ukraine. But her last name is Ukrainian. It's Panchenko. And you know, if she was a Russian, it would be Panchenkov, but for a woman, it'd be Panchenkova. And but in Ukrainian, it's all Panchenko. They end with an O, and they skip the rest of the ending. And but her last name is Panchenko. And I listen to her when I'm out for a good time. She had one that was about Zelensky, and who does Zelensky want to offend in Moscow? Who's he after? Who's he out to get in Moscow? And she played it wasn't satirical. It was I think it was. She was attempting to insult him even, and did a pretty good job of it. And it's 25 minutes. Many of his old videos, because for 20 years almost, he tried, well, in fact, it was longer than 20 years, starting in the mid-90s until he ran for president in 2019. He was always trying to win awards and get things. He tried to get into the School of Diplomacy. This I did not know, that he tried to get into the School of Diplomacy in Moscow and was turned down. And he tried to do a couple other things in his youth that didn't go the way he wanted. But he was seen as a comedian, and so he came in, but he never won first. He wasn't the primary guy in any of the shows. So she's basically beat up on him for 20 minutes, and it showed him in his youth, honoring Putin, him in his youth, honoring Russia, him and completely speaking Russian the whole time, and his anti-Russian language things didn't take place until he in fact he talked about it while he was being elected, that he wasn't going, he made fun of that sort of thing, like I do, like telling people they can't speak their native language was a little bit odd for him. He thought it was a bit ridiculous to tell them they couldn't speak their own language. Doesn't make a lot of sense in his mind. And I kind of agree with him on that. And so anyway, but now he's changed his tune. His tune is different now. And so I don't know. It was an interesting. It didn't have any subtitles, so I suppose it's just something to tell you about how it how it came out, because you can't really go back and listen to it the way I did, because I didn't even see any subtitles on there, not in English anyway. You couldn't just turn them on and they'd be in English. So, and I thought that was pretty interesting, because he, in the subtitle was, "I will conquer Moscow," and he was, he was going to conquer Moscow as a comic, and he never did. He got second place a lot, or he was the vice chairman, the word is zamestитель, what would it be in I don't know, the co-host, I guess, would be the best one, but the junior host, he wasn't the host, he was the co-host, and the host was always somebody else. And so at any rate, she made fun of him for basically 25 minutes, and I can see why she's banned and has sanctions against her in Ukraine, because she's pretty brutal to him. And anyway, it didn't go too well. So let's get on with the topic of the judicial review. My goal with this is to talk a little bit about, because I got to thinking about this, and so I did a little research on it, and I've had this thought process for a while. I can't remember if it was on a JR show or on somebody had a show about judicial stuff, or if it's something that I've heard elsewhere, that the judicial branch really isn't limited. Now, I've thought this for a while. The judicial branch runs itself. Now, remember, we're supposed to have in America, this is my theory, and you can decide whether you agree with it after I present to you what I'm going to present to you tonight. And I had this problem all the way back in law school when I would talk about it, and that I have this problem with co-equal branches. And for the first 30 years or so of the Supreme Court, I think they did too. I think it was the weaker sibling of the legislative and the executive branches. And they've created for themselves this powerful role, and created, telling other people what they will do. But it didn't exist until they created it for themselves. And I remember having thoughts like this and bringing it up and say, well, no, it needed to happen because judicial review. We get judicial review. Yeah, well, who created judicial review? The judges, the Supreme Court created judicial review. We get to declare whether a law is constitutional or not constitutional. And so they decided they had that power, and they created it, and it's kind of developed from there. So we'll get into that a little bit. But my thought process, it was, and what I'd like you to get from this is, develop your own thought process. I think that the executive branch arguably has the biggest impact on sudden change. Okay. The legislative branch has, they can write law that you have to follow. The all that the court process has is judicial review, and they didn't have it initially. They gave it to themselves about 30 years after the foundation of the country, basically. And I started out thinking about, because somebody in one of their shows, like I was saying, either JR or Ike or somebody else, I don't know, I don't remember even where I heard it, was like, well, what if they tell Trump to do something? What if Trump just doesn't do it? What if Trump just said, I'm not, hell with you, there's your order, go enforce it, And so I've reviewed instances when that has happened, and they're pretty limited, and they don't give you a lot. And then I also wanted, because I believe that one of the worst things on the planet is the longevity of terms of office for judges, for state, senators, House of Reps guys that aren't limited, that are not term limited in some way. I think they all ought to be enforced out after some period of time. And I think it ought to be some kind of a federal putting in that power. And because I don't believe that either the executive or the legislative controls the judiciary at all. That's what I believe. And the examples of how they are controlled are very few and far between. So with that backdrop, and the fact that I would like to see some sort of limitations, I want to get into the Term Act, which a senator has brought up again. I don't think it'll go anywhere, but I certainly think it should, and I can give you some idea where to go to get involved in a couple of these things if you so feel the urge. But how are these other branches supposed to, or how do they in practice, depending on your point of view, how do they limit the judiciary? Okay, I think the judiciary is unhinged, and they're never limited. They are untouchable in every sense of the word. You can't do it. Impeachment is extremely rare. It's been used very, very rarely, and I had some numbers on that. I think it was like 15 times or something like that. That it's been used since the founding of the country. 15 times they've gotten rid of a judge. But how the legislative branch is supposed to, or allegedly can, limit the judiciary is they can strip the judiciary of certain power. Okay, they can limit what cases that a federal court can hear under Article 3, Section 2. And then in 1869, nearly 100 years after we were founded, the Congress, in the middle of a case, changed the jurisdiction in the middle of a case to block the ruling. Okay? And allegedly, Missouri's legislature can do the same, but they don't do anything either. I haven't been able to find any Missouri examples of a limitation in the case. And so there was a case called Ex parte McArdle, the one that came out in 1869. Okay. And in this case, in the discussion, basically, the appellate jurisdiction of the court is conferred by the Constitution and not derived from Congress itself, but is conferred by the Constitution, specifically saying, with such exceptions and under such regulation as Congress may make, and therefore acts of Congress that affirm such jurisdiction have always been construed as accepting from it all cases not expressly described and provided for. Now that sounds like legalese, because it is. That's actually from the case itself in 1868. And they when you read cases way back then, they always spoke more flowery than we do now anyway, or in more British format than I like. And what that basically means is they can only hear those cases that the legislative branch tells them they can hear. That's how it's always been presumed to be. You can't hear cases that you don't have the authority to hear, and the Constitution itself says it can only do it with such regulation as Congress makes. So they can set, for example, statute of limitations. That's by statute. That's not by That's not by the court making them up and saying, I think it ought to be 10 years. And no, it's set by Congress, and Congress going, it ought to be 2. It ought to be 5. It ought to be whatever. But that is set, and an appellate can go. So when, therefore, here's more language from the case. When the Congress enacts, this court shall have the appellate jurisdiction over final decisions of the circuit court in certain cases. The act operates as an exception of such jurisdiction, and the repeal of that act would mean that they can't hear it, because what the judiciary did is in the middle of it, they changed the authority of the court midstream. And so even midstream, Congress can limit the authority of the court. And so I think that is important, okay? And basically, Congress has the authority to withdraw it. And let's see, where were the particulars of that case? During the Civil War Reconstruction, newspaper publisher McCardle printed some incendiary articles advocating opposition to Reconstruction laws enacted by Congress. He was jailed by a military commander under the Military Reconstruction Act of 1867. McCardle invoked habeas corpus in the Circuit Court of the Southern District of Mississippi. The judge sent him back into custody, finding the military actions legal under Congress's law. He appealed to the Supreme Court under habeas corpus, which granted appellate jurisdiction to review the denial of habeas corpus. After the case was argued, but before the opinion was delivered, Congress suspended the Supreme Court's jurisdiction over the case, exercising the powers granted under Article 3, Section 2. So, Chief Justice Chase, writing for a unanimous court, validated the congressional withdrawal of the court's jurisdiction, which meant he had to stay in jail. The basis of this repeal was the exception clause of Article 3, Section 2. Chase pointedly reminded his readers that the 1868 statute repealing jurisdiction does not affect jurisdiction which was previously exercised. Since the court held it lacked jurisdiction to hear the case, the second question was never answered. Since Congress had withdrawn jurisdiction to hear the case, McCardle had no legal resource to challenge his imprisonment in federal court. So, that shows that the court, if Congress chose to do something, they could, but they'll never do anything, and they just never do. Nobody screws with them anymore. There's never anything to change the structure of what's in court, except there's something out there now of where they have it. So that was an important case. So they can strip the court of jurisdiction. Congress also has control of the purse strings, right? And here was something that surprised me a little bit because I didn't know this. I knew it wasn't all that huge, but think about this. The federal court's funding in 2023, all federal courts combined, $8 billion, which is a fraction of federal spending, came out to less than 1% of the budget. Less than 1%. How do you like that? Very small amount. That they can control the budget. Budget cuts, forced furloughs, they say delayed trials, and then Missouri has 1.6% of the state budget goes to the court, and so it's pretty small. So they have jurisdictional questions, budget control, impeachment. They can impeach and remove federal judges for high crimes and misdemeanors. There's only been 15 since 1789. Missouri can also impeach state judges, but it's extremely rare. And then Congress can decide to change the court structure. For example, how many judgeships actually exist? There are 677 district judges nationwide, but Missouri's legislature sets circuit court numbers, and that's a Missouri deal, but that's the legislature. Okay, so those really limits? I leave that for you to decide. Jurisdiction is set, but nobody screws with it anymore. Budget control is set, but nobody screws with it anymore. Impeachment is set, but nobody screws with it anymore. Court structure is set, but nobody screws with it anymore. Is anybody ever going to change? And by the way, what about the legislature imposing term limits? Where's that? That's not listed anywhere. I suppose it would fall under court structure. You could put that. The executive branch has even less restriction of the judicial branch, right? So, in my opinion, you can disagree with this if you'd like, but the president can pick federal judges, so he gets to appoint them. But once appointed, they're untouchable. Once appointed, they're around forever. These guys, they don't give a crap. So you got to kiss the rear end of the president or whoever gets you put into power until you get put into power. And after that, you're untouchable for life. Okay. For life. And I disagree with that. Okay. So the president, all he gets to do is appoint somebody. Then they call it enforcement. Now, I don't understand how this necessarily limits enforcement. And before we get to enforcement, we're going to get to the other part of the executive branch, which is pardons. They can pardon somebody. And so the president can pardon any federal conviction, nullifying a judicial sentence. And that's, Missouri governor can do that in Missouri as well. So that can undercut a judge's power. But those aren't used all that often either. Arguably in the last several years, it's been far more popular to pardon all kinds of people for all kinds of bad behavior. But I don't know if that necessarily restricts anything the judges. They can undo something. But, okay, is that really a limitation? Appointment and pardon? That's it? The final thing they talk about, or that we're going to talk about, is enforcement. Okay, courts have no power to enforce anything, and that's what we talked about earlier. That how many times, when has the court said, well, this is illegal, you have to do this, or you're telling somebody to do something? This is coming up more and more often right now. And what if Trump just said, well, screw you, I ain't doing it? Like infamous words, which we'll get to later. You can, good luck enforcing it, because they don't have the power to enforce anything. And we'll get into marshals, the court marshals. The marshals work for the executive branch, technically. They're all subject to the Attorney General of the United States, not the court. So the court doesn't control. They can't tell the marshals to go out and do anything. They can order it, but that's at the direction of the executive branch. And arguably, and in fact, in practice too, they could tell the marshals they're not going to do it. Or marshals could tell them I'm not going to do that. So I don't know. I suppose Congress. So basically, Congress can tell a judge, you can't hear that case. And the judge has to obey. So they have, in my view, more power over a judiciary if they ever did anything about it. But they never do, right? So federal judges can only hear cases of federal law. They can't give advisory opinions. Means you got to have a case that is currently pending by a person who actually has a what's called standing in that case. And if you don't have standing, you can't bring the case. So the court can't give political opinions, although they do. I think they do. They can't give advisory opinions, but I also think that they do that. And they take a controversy, and then, in my view, they fail to give reviews in a lot of cases, especially the Supreme Court. They don't. They choose what they're going to hear and not hear, and far too often they don't hear anything. So I don't know. When you ask questions about, like, I did a Google search, and they claim that the court is, you can see the slant in what people have. Courts get, the budget's down. They're not being given enough. And listen to this. If you do a search for the pay in Missouri of circuit court judges, they earn $121,000 a year. And they lose talent to private firms. Associate circuit judges make even less, which causes turnover in those positions. Now, I would argue that they also have, no fear of being, they got a job forever. There's something about security. If you get in that position, you get retirement in Missouri, like right away. So, those things are certainly prevalent in for judges. So I'm not so sure that there's such a limitation after all. I don't. I truly don't see it as much of a limitation. So, at any rate, we'll move on with that, because I wanted to get to a couple of cases. There's allegedly so they you can focus on like they always did in law school, and I remember not liking this at all. They always want to focus on professional limitations, ethical limitations on judges, right? And let's talk about those, right? Federal judges they have to follow, allegedly, the Code of Conduct for U.S. judges, which bars political activity, improper gifts, or conflicts of interests. Missouri judges have to follow the Code of Judicial Conduct, which is Rule 2.4, and similar restrictions of, political activity, blah, blah, blah. Violations risk discipline or impeachment. They are never used, these limitations, especially in Missouri. For example, and you generally don't hear the Supreme Court do it. Judges can't comment publicly on pending cases, and that limits their ability to defend their own rulings. But they're the ones writing the opinion, or their clerk is. So they, how do they get? I don't know that they should have to do that. But ethics depends on the person. Nobody's going to do anything to the court. They never do. Now, they say here that there's political pressure. Federal judges face scrutiny from politicians and the media, especially on hot-button issues. Well, you're forcing me to make comment on it. And I'd like to believe all the judges are, ethical, professionally, ethical, personally. I don't believe that. But because they're protected by lifetime tenure, and what's the public going to do if the public doesn't like what they're doing? Not much. You're not going to get them. Now, remember what Missouri has. In Missouri, allegedly, we have a retention election under the Missouri plan, which I've talked about in detail a couple of times, right? This Missouri plan puts a judge up for basically a vote of confidence, where you can, and judges can not judges, lawyers can review the judges that they practice in front of. The public, the juries can review, in little cases that come out, but that is also pretty rarely used. You got to be a pretty much of a deadbeat for them not to just rubber stamp or ignore it. And it's nonsensical with no term limits. And I want to make sure we get to the term act that I wanted to talk about. And then there was a good article. It's kind of long, so I'm going to summarize it. That came from the Brennan Institute for Justice that I want to talk about as well. Somebody flying around my head at it. Got a bug, a moth of some sort in here. It's driving me nuts. It flying straight from my mouth. That's not good. At any rate, sorry for that interruption, but I think I'm a little punchy tonight. Maybe that wasn't a bug. Maybe I'm seeing things. Who knows? They claim now this part I didn't like, and I saw this while out looking on the internet for certain things, and because this I absolutely do not believe. They want to say that federal judges juggle hundreds of cases with no cap on how many hours they work. And Missouri circuit judges often handle 1,000 cases a year, and they don't get a break. They can't just take a vacation mid-case. So let's all cry for them. Let's all feel sorry. They chose this profession. They set their own calendar. They can take vacation. They can do what they're going to do, and they set their calendar. I don't like them claiming that this workload burnout. If you don't like it, take a different job. That you tell me that a lawyer handling hundreds of cases, 1,000 cases a year, that's not unusual. That's not even all that many. That's certainly public defenders have 10 times that amount, that they have to take. And they don't make any money. It'd be different if they made some money. Anyway, we'll advocate for that a little bit, maybe on a different program. But they have limited discretion, allegedly. Okay, so basically, what the point is here is that there are mandatory sentencing laws that judges are required to follow. Okay, and if they deviate too far from that, it looks like favoritism. So a lot of times the statutes that the legislature puts into place and the executive branch signs tell how much a minimum sentence is for, who cares, whatever it is, a drug charge in state law or in federal law, or I don't know, racketeering, you pick them. But these mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines really force the judge to follow those sorts of laws. So arguably, the more detailed the statute, the better restriction on judicial powers. That's, those, and on the federal level, they certainly follow those. There's a point system, and you go through this checklist of how you put it in. The prosecutors know it. Zip, zip, zip. A lot of federal, I only did a couple, 3 federal criminals a year, and not all that many. And so I always made sure to follow the rule. You get the rule out and you get on the sentencing guideline, you read whatever the guideline is. But those prosecutors know it inside and out, and they'll walk you through it to make sure you know exactly what you're doing. Because hell, you're generally going to lose in federal court anyway. So my question was, who's more constrained, and I tried to figure that out on my own tonight. Who is more constrained? Is it a Missouri judge or a federal judge? Frankly, I don't think either one of them are constrained at all. Arguably, you could say that a lot of positions in Missouri, if they're not under this Missouri, the alleged nonpartisan court plan that appoints judges, if they're not under that, they can be limited by the vote, or limited by something else. But under our nonsensical plan, they're appointed by the bar anyway, and so I don't think that the governor even has much in the power of enforcement. So I think federal is limited more than state, and I definitely would support something to limit the appointment of judges under this alleged Missouri court plan, nonpartisan, which it's not. Nonpartisan means bar appointed, and so I'm very much against that system. We can go into that again on another show, but I think that federal judges are probably regulated more than Missouri are. And neither one of them, you could probably get more money from, because the surprise to me was that even Missouri, it's less than 2% of the budget is spent on the courts. And on the federal system, it's like 0.5% or less that is spent on the courts. So if you're arguing that you don't have enough people in the courts, I wouldn't mind jacking up the numbers. That might not be a big deal or a big expense. I could see that. I don't know. I think it's I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on it. Should Congress control the budget? Should they do something? I've been looking for some examples where the executive branch. So here's my search for today, and I found a few, but it's pretty tough to find. Okay, and I want to tell you a few stories about it, and then we'll try to get into this new Term Act and go into some of that. Okay, because there's an effort to term limit justices, and I like it. I'm for term limits government wide, frankly, and I think I've talked about that before. So, but I went out and looked for any cases where the executive branch ignored or resisted court orders. Okay. And probably the most famous is something called Worcester v. Georgia, 1832, which the federal executive defied the court, the president. U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Georgia's laws regulating Cherokee lands were unconstitutional and affirmed that Cherokee sovereignty and ordered the release of missionary Samuel Worcester, imprisoned in Georgia. They ordered him to be released. So that would mean that the executive, who at the time was Andrew Jackson, would be required to release Mr. Worcester from prison, federal prison. And President Jackson reportedly said, John Marshall, the Chief Justice, has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. And Jackson's administration refused to enforce the ruling, just didn't do it. They sided with Georgia's push to remove the Cherokee. This led to the Trail of Tears. The federal government took no action to protect Cherokee rights or to free Worcester, who remained jailed until Georgia pardoned him later. So the impact of this case, the Supreme Court ruling, doesn't mean crap, doesn't mean anything, doesn't, if the executive refuses to follow it. And what are they going to do? Force him to follow it? Send a marshal? They can't do that. He works for the executive branch. Judge is going to go down and release him himself? Can't do that. He's the executive. So legislature can set laws. The only one that can enforce them is the executive. And you can take that all the way down to the county level. So if a law is enacted and somebody take action, it's got to be somebody in the executive because they have that authority, right? And, if they're the executive of the county and they've created a law and nobody's going to enforce it, then why can't they? They are the executive. And if you're the chief executive, then arguably you could enforce it yourself. Couldn't you? You could go and do that. Anyway, basically it said Jackson and everybody else said the court's ruling is toothless since you have no executive backing, and this exposed the weakness of the judicial branch. But it takes a very strong president to not do it. Okay. And this happened a few times during desegregation, but Jackson flat out ignored the Supreme Court, and he pushed the Native Americans off their own land. And so the executive told the judges, well, good luck, which is exactly what he said. Well, let him enforce it then, because he can't. And so they have to work together somehow. And so sometimes if the president is particularly strong enough, you don't have to do anything, right? But desegregation, actually, even in Missouri, took some time. So, and I until researching it yesterday and today, I did not know this about Missouri, Kansas City. After Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, the Supreme Court ordered school desegregation. Southern states, including Missouri, resisted, and some federal actions lagged behind. Okay, in Missouri, the local school boards, which are under state executive oversight, delayed desegregation for years. Get this, and I didn't know this. For instance, Kansas City schools remained segregated into the 1970s, despite federal court orders, and state officials dragged their feet on enforcement. In Missouri versus Jenkins in 1990, addressed funding but showed documented earlier resistance. In Arkansas, Governor Orville Faubus defied the federal order as well to desegregate Little Rock schools in 1957. I mean, that's right after the ruling, right? 3 years after the Brown v. Board of Education. And he deployed the National Guard to block black students from attending. But President Eisenhower eventually sent federal troops, but only after public pressure forced him to do so. And he wasn't going. It appeared that he wasn't going to either. So, state executives, governors, school boards, county commissioners, whoever, can ignore court orders and or delay enacting or acting on any of the decisions, which might lead one to think that the judiciary is weak. Well, I think they are, because they can't enforce anything, but it takes a strong-minded executive to put them in their place, and nobody ever does. Nobody ever puts the judges in their place. And so, I'm almost done with these examples, because I definitely want to get to the Term Act that's coming along, and then discuss some of the reasons why I think it's important. And then let's get to the sanctuary cities and immigration enforcement, which has been going on for 15 years now. Some with some fairly recent examples, especially with the Trumpster, right? Federal courts have issued injunctions against the Trump administration policies targeting sanctuary cities, meaning withholding federal funds from cities like Chicago for not cooperating with immigration and customs enforcement. And in City and County of San Francisco versus Trump in 2018, a federal court blocked that policy, sanctuary cities policy, as unconstitutional. The Trump administration continued to pressure cities through ICE actions and public statements, delaying compliance. They didn't outright refuse, but they definitely dragged their feet and didn't honor the court's orders promptly. So the impact of this means judges can rule, but the executive, if they don't do anything, there's not much anyone can do about it, truly. But the Trump team didn't like it back in 2018. They certainly didn't like it. Don't like what's going on now, and they're taking a much stronger position. So there's also one that's a Missouri one, and maybe you know about this and maybe you don't. I knew a little bit about it, but I read up on some detail on it, and it's the state still the Governor Parsons didn't do anything about it. Missouri's Second Amendment Preservation Act declared federal gun laws invalid in the state and barred state officials from enforcing federal law. The federal courts, including in 2023, U.S. v. Missouri, ruled SAPA unconstitutional and ordered state officials to comply with that federal law. But Missouri's governor and attorney general, both of them, publicly vowed to uphold SAPA anyway. Said, screw you. We're and directed state law enforcement to ignore federal gun regulations despite the court's ruling. While the case remained in appeals court, state officials continued to not cooperate and defied the federal judiciary. There ain't much you can do about it, Missouri's executive branch openly, denied, compliance with the federal court order, and there wasn't much that the federal judge could do unless the federal executive chose to do something, right? And, basically the governor told the federal judge, we aren't listening to you. What are you going to do? It's state versus federal. And that one was still, there's still some argument about it, but it's complied with mostly now. Nobody's really resisting too much. And the last one I'll tell you a little bit about was this was in a delay again by Trump. And so you can't go out and find too many of these examples. They just don't exist. And I'm interested in hearing if anybody else has any. I'd be happy to listen to them. But this one, the Trump versus United States, you don't even find this much. I spent some time on Westlaw trying to find these things today, doing some legal research and trying to find cases where they denied it. And when I start doing legal research, I get into rabbit holes that never end. And you just, get underground and you just go this rabbit hole to that rabbit hole. They're all interconnected, and you can go on for days and miss your I like legal research. It's especially if you have the time to spend a day on the computer doing it. But you can't do it forever. So the last one we're going to talk about is the census and executive delay. So in Trump versus New York in 2020, Trump administration attempted to exclude undocumented immigrants from the census count. And the lower courts issued injunctions, like federal New York court issued injunctions against his policy of not counting undocumented immigrants in the census. Frankly, I agree with that position. But, the Commerce Department under Trump's control delayed complying with the court order because the court order said you have to include them. And they cited logistical issues. Continued their efforts to implement the policy until Biden took over. And then, Biden took over and they changed everything, right? And the executive branch's slow response under Trump, kind of ignored the order of the court, right? So I suppose you can limit. Now, I hope that helps you in understanding my thought process on how little the court is generally limited. I don't believe that they really are all that limited. There were very few times when the executive branch tells the court no. We had the resistance to Brown versus Board of Education, resistance under SAPA. There was one case on Lincoln that I found was pretty cool. Where in the world is that case? It's in my notes here that I got to squeeze to, because the Lincoln one I found interesting. And where is it? Cherokee Nation v. Georgia. I got that one. Ex parte Merriman. I think this is it. Yeah. Federal, and this is 1861. The president is Abraham Lincoln. Federal executive defiance during the Civil War. Okay, ex parte Merriman. It's a 17 FCAS F 144, and looks like Central Court of Maryland, 1861. During the Civil War, Chief Justice Taney, who was sitting as a circuit judge, issued a writ of habeas for a John Merriman, a Maryland civilian detained by the military for suspected secessionist activity. Taney ruled that President Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus was unconstitutional, as only Congress can suspend it. He ordered Merriman's release. Lincoln and the military ignored the ruling, keeping Merriman detained. Lincoln justified his action in a message to Congress, arguing wartime necessity trumped the judicial order. The administration continued suspending habeas corpus nationwide and defied the judiciary. Merriman was eventually released on bail, but not because of the order. Lincoln's executive never did comply with the ruling, and habeas suspensions persisted until 1863 because the judiciary had no mechanism to force compliance during wartime. And you can find this on Westlaw 17 F case 144. And it's pretty cool. Lincoln told the Supreme Court justice, your habeas corpus ruling, have fun with that. It's wartime. I can do whatever I want. And he did. And then there was another case. This was 1958, the state executive in Cooper. This was Mississippi, though. Cooper versus Aaron, 358, United States Supreme Court 1. Again, after Brown versus Board of Education, Supreme Court reaffirmed that Arkansas, and by extension, other states like Mississippi, must desegregate schools, rejecting state claims of interposition to nullify federal law. The court ordered immediate compliance with desegregation. Right? Mississippi's governor and state officials, led by Governor James Coleman and later by Ross Barnett, refused to comply. Mississippi maintained segregated schools into the 60s. Missouri did until the 70s in Kansas City, with state executives directing local boards to defy court orders. For example, University of Mississippi resisted admitting James Meredith in 1962 until federal intervention. Mississippi's defiance persisted in some districts until the 70s, and that did go on for a little bit. So there really aren't that many cases that it was a 1990 Missouri versus Jenkins case where they talked about desegregation. You can find that at Missouri v. Jenkins 495 U.S. 33 is the case citation. Federal courts ordered Kansas City to desegregate following decades of resistance. Judge Russell Clark issued orders for school funding and integration plans, but state and local executives resisted, and nobody in Missouri forced them to do it. So the governor didn't do anything. So interesting stuff, huh? I could go down these sorts of rabbit holes for days, but I wanted to get to one of my thought processes on these, because there is a case. Supreme Court term limits is being offered. Okay. And there are, I think, good reasons to like this. The article is long. I think I can get through most of it. Or summarize most of it, but it's really long and it has so many references. So this is a nice legal brief read, which is a lot of references. And basically, when you write a legal brief, you have to cite where you get the information. So a good legal writer will write a sentence. For example, in their very introduction, it starts, and this is how lawyers work. If I don't mean to give you lessons on law school or anything, but everything you put up has to have a foundation, something that you're quoting from law stare decisis means the decision has already been made. And you have to follow. If you can find something from a court document that says your point of view, then you can put it up as the proposition and you cite that reference. So basically, this entire article is Nike tons of references. And the first sentence of this is, if I can get my screen. So the suggestion is Supreme Court term limits, which I support, and I support it for all judiciary positions. I support it. It ought to be more organized and better. These lifetime appointments, screw that. And double dipping on retirement, screw that. That ought to be gone. Supreme Court term limits. They are suggesting staggered 18-year terms to bring regular turnover to the bench. The result would be a court that better reflects prevailing public values. If you want to find this entire article and read it, now I don't know, they're asking for money, of course, but the Brennan Center for Justice, probably a little on the liberal side. I don't know that I'm going to, I won't donate. I might go to the Get Involved, depending on what their thought processes are. I mean, in Missouri and elsewhere, that I like this, and I suggested something similar myself, and now I found it. I thought that when I first started pitching this stuff on my own, and I figured there had to be somebody somewhere also that thought like I did, and I did some searches, and I found a senator that proposed something under the Term Act, and this Brennan Center says some things about a few other places. But if you want to see this Brennan Center, you go to the BrennanCenter.org and check it out. And it's basically Supreme Court term limits. So, and their basis for it is this introduction, which I'm going to share with you in its entirety because it's important. Today's Supreme Court has assumed a degree of power and importance that would have been unrecognizable in the founding era. Now, when I told you in the beginning, they didn't even have, the court was considered a weak piece of, it wasn't as powerful as the other two. But it created its own judicial review by making things constitutional or unconstitutional. But they are now a million times more powerful than they were back then, both in practice and in fact. And they've taken most of this power themselves. Okay, and the executive and the executive and the legislative, I do not believe, effectively limit the courts. I think the courts are out of control. That's me. You don't have to believe that. You don't want to. On the federal level, for sure. On the Missouri level, well, for sure too. Different reasons, but for sure. But they've assumed a degree of power, and there's so many different references to this. Professor Jamal Green captured this development in a statement to the Presidential Commission on the Supreme Court. A different political and legal landscape in a nation of 330 million has the potential to turn on the views of a single person. That single person is unelected and is one of only 9. He can be confirmed by a bare and strictly partisan majority in the Senate, plays a major role in deciding what cases they hear, can potentially remain in office for 40 or 50 years, and can, in effect, choose the ideology of their own replacement, who may in turn hold office for another 40 or 50 years. So that's a guy named Professor Jamal Green. You can, and he's Columbia Law School is where you can read about him. But that's another rabbit hole you could get down is reading all of the references to this. So I'm going to try to stay on the upper level and keep it all in there. A recent cascade of ethics scandals lays bare a system in which justices have tremendous power for decades with no accountability. Now, I agree with this, or I'm not saying I wouldn't give it to you, but I want to point out that I agree with this. Court rulings are increasingly unmoored from democratic values and the principle of judicial restraint. At the same time, polarization of the political parties and the justices themselves dramatically increases the partisan stakes in confirmation, which leads to a broken system. It absolutely does. And public trust in the courts is at a historic low. That Harvard Law Review that I quoted a couple of weeks ago said 26% approve of the courts. So for all these reasons, including Samuel Trapp, there are growing calls for reform. I think they miss part of the boat by saying they also don't review any cases. The Supreme Court doesn't do shit, pardon my French, but they don't. They hear less than 6% of the cases that are presented to them, and the justices don't even read them all. And so what do? Their clerks do it all. They don't do crap until it becomes something political. That's what I say. And I'd like to do some sunshine requests and see what I can get for them. Give me just a second here. Sorry. I had to take a sip for a dry throat. Sorry about that. Anyway, for all these reasons, there are growing calls for concern. Proposals are starting to appear. They want to create an ethics code. They won't follow it anyway. Or expand the court to strip its jurisdiction. What? You make it bigger and you take some of it as but one of the most popular options is also the most transformative. Term limits. And they say, and this is not something that I say, this is one of the plans that they talk about, establish an 18-year term for a judge because they keep getting younger and younger and stick around longer and longer. And we'll get into that in a minute. Under this system, judges would sit in staggered terms, so a new vacancy opens up every 2 years, right? Each president would have 2 and only 2 appointments during a 4-year term. So if you're president for 8 years, you get to appoint 4. Okay? This paper, which is a long paper, and I'm just going to summarize, but I'm reading this whole introduction for you, is well worth the read. This paper explains how the reform would work, why it would bolster the court's legitimacy. Now, they're only talking about the Supreme Court. I think this needs to be at all levels. There ain't no reason that you can't have a career as a person, practicing law somewhere and then become a judge for 18 years. Get a full retirement for that and then fade into the sunset. Why do you have to stick around for 50 freaking years? Why? Who made that up? It's the same for the Senate. The same. We want to limit the president. Why? Is the president the most powerful, or is one of the other branches the most powerful? Well, I think the ego that the Supreme Court thinks that they are. but I don't think that they are, nor should they be. All they do is make a ruling, which if we don't like it, well, the other two should get together and change it. That's how it's supposed to work, right? So basically, it's the core element of this reform could be adopted by statutes, Congress, which is consistent with the Constitution. You can also establish senior justices. So in the event that you need another one of the ones who's already served 18 years can be a senior replacement to fill the spot of somebody who dies until an appointment comes up. So they would only get their appointments as the time comes up. It's important that people, this plan or any plan, I'm glad people are finally starting to talk about it. So these senior justices could hear cases by designation on lower courts, step in to hear cases on the Supreme Court in the event of a recusal or a vacancy, and assist with the administration and management of federal courts. This framework is similar to the existing system of senior judges. So senior judges are judges that hang around, and I always used to love several of them in central Missouri that would do the negotiation cases. So you have a judge assigned to your case. That judge can't negotiate your case towards settlement, but if you get with one of these senior judges who's an old judge, they come in, they've been around for 100 years, and they come in and they help you settle the cases. It's very useful. So I'm not against that, and that the senior justices have been in place since 1937, and there's a lot of references for that in this article, but we won't get into them. But rather than leave the timing of senior status up to the judge's discretion, because the judge himself can say, well, I'm a senior judge, I'm going to stick around, but I don't want to be an active judge anymore. I'm gone, but I'll stay a senior judge and, work particular cases. So there would be a set schedule. I like the idea of a set schedule. Okay. The case for reform is very compelling. On average, listen to these numbers. Justices today sit on the bench for more than a decade longer than their predecessors did as recently as the 60s. Several justices now on the court are likely to hold office over as many as 9 presidential terms. Unbounded tenure allows one justice to shape the direction of law for generations without regard for the evolving views and composition of the electorate. That's a problem, friends and neighbors. But it's not only a problem on the Supreme Court, it's a problem on all the appellate courts. It's a problem in federal court for sure. And it's also a problem in Missouri. I think the legislative branches of Missouri, certainly, and the federal should do something about this. Of course, we want them to do something about themselves as well, and they never do. The only one that's ever been limited is the old Trumpster. And there's indications he's thinking he might. Now, here's another important point. No other major democracy in the world provides life tenure for judges who hear constitutional cases. They just don't. And this presidential commission on the Supreme Court talks about the term limits. This came out 2021. Well, that was a White House generated. It's again, I shouldn't get into all of the references that they put out on because I'll get down a rabbit hole and never get to them. And we're running short on time. With today's intense ideological polarization, every Supreme Court vacancy is monumental. The raw power of politics has replaced constitutional norms, upending the confirmation process. I find it hard to not agree with this. And I don't know much about this Brennan Center, but this, at least the preamble, I definitely agree with. So the constitutional hardball was very notorious when Republican senators refused to consider Barack Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland. Now, you saw what he did to the country after being denied his rightful position, according to him anyway. That's what I think. And he just pretended he was untouchable, and for the most part he was, uh, on as Attorney General. Um, and anyway, then immediately, um, they didn't bring in the nomination of Merrick Garland, but then they pushed through Amy Coney Barrett in October 2020. And when he was, after the election already started to get that done and squeeze it in before the old Biden guy took office. The result of these dynamics has been that presidents have had starkly disparate imprints on the court. Donald Trump appointed 3 justices in 4 years. Presidents Clinton, Bush, Obama appointed 2 justices each in 8 years. This wide variation, as well as its impact on the development of American law, is impossible to square with the principles of democratic legitimacy. Now, there's a possibility, I don't think it's very big, most of the court's fairly young these days, that the old Trumpster might get to appoint some more. I think I'm all for changing what's going on. If you took an 18-year active term and regular appointments, every president would get to appoint 2 during the term. This system would put a democratic link between the court and the public. Because remember, as the public, we're the ones getting the shaft here without term limits. Because we don't get to appoint these. It's all luck of the draw who dies when they're in office and who retires. Ginsburg would have never retired. I mean, yeah, while Trump was appointing, she would have stuck around for sure and then retired as soon as as soon as Biden became president. Unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, she did die though. And so that gave Trump, is the death of somebody any sort of, I don't know what, thing to look forward to for something as big as the Supreme Court of the United States? Shouldn't there be some kind of limitation? I think this reform would encourage better functioning and less politically charged confirmation, especially if you did it across the board. Shorter terms would lower the stakes for each nomination, because right now we're appointing 40-year-olds that could sit there till they're 90 or 100, depending on who's going to be there, and they don't want to leave. That it's the same deal for them. Regular appointments eliminate the destabilizing impact of late-term vacancies because of an unexpected death or retirement. Well, I agree and disagree on that, but most Americans support term limit for justices. Now, they say just on the Supreme Court. I'll bet you there's a pretty good bunch of people that would love to see it across the board. I know I'm one of them. Since 2022, several polls found that more than 2/3 of the public are in favor of reform. This includes 3/4 of Democrats. Well, because the court is twisted Republican right now, according to them. 2/3 of independents and half of Republicans. This is a long-standing bipartisan support since at least 2014. A broad array of scholars also support. National Constitution Center, this Brennan Institute, Presidential Commission on the Supreme Court was created by Joe Biden to evaluate options for Supreme Court reform. Now, I don't agree with a damn thing that guy did, but term limits enjoys considerable bipartisan support. The Constitution gives Congress latitude to determine when they do it. And the reasons for this, we're going to have to go through a little quickly. The court is increasingly unaccountable to anyone. The only option you have to enforce anything is have the executive say, "No, I'm not doing that. I'm not following your rules. Your rules don't apply to me. If I don't feel like it, I'm not gonna do it. I'm not going to enforce whatever that law is. I'm just not going to do it. And that is, I'd like to see people work together, right? In 1803, John Marshall, in that case I was talking about, Marbury versus Madison, created the first unconstitutional, which is judicial review, was just created in Marbury versus Madison. But they didn't strike down another federal law as unconstitutional for more than 50 years. Okay? And that was Dred Scott versus Sanford, which barred Congress from freeing slaves within federal territories. But now times have changed. As the size and scope of the federal government expands, they are staying in office forever. They're not leaving, and it's extremely long-term placement of these guys. Modern justices are serving unusually long term. So the first 180 years of the United States history, justices on average served 15 years. But in the 1970s, the tenure began to balloon, and in recent years, justices serve an average of 26 years. Justices appointed at the age of 50, which is a supermajority of justices in the court today, can serve 35 to 40 years. And that's going to go up if we don't do something about it. I think then there's also this strategic retirement that goes on. You know, like I was telling you, Ruth Bader Ginsburg wouldn't have retired until a Democrat was in office because she wants to keep that spot. Well, then she passed away, and the Republicans real quick throw in Amy Coney Barrett. And it's I don't mean to laugh about it, but that's a hell of a way to run a country, right? Wait for people to die. It's a dysfunctional confirmation process. No democratic legitimacy because their people don't have it. No other democracy does what we do. The only way you can reform it is by statute or constitutional amendment and then statute. It's a good model to change it into something, and I believe we ought to be able to do it, and to make it much more fair than what they're looking. This is a pretty interesting article, but it is pretty long. And there's one section called Benefit of Reform. 18-year term limits and regularized appointments will help address much of the structural dysfunction damaging the Supreme Court's legitimacy and why people hate it so much. And the implementing statute should have a strong severability provision so that each reform can stand on its own, because they're trying to reform other things. And boy, if they would overhaul the judiciary, I tell you what, I'd be a happy camper. And in Missouri, they really need to do something. I could do another entire show just on Missouri, and I might at that, because I am very much for getting rid of this alleged nonpartisan court plan. BS. I don't know. Regular turnover would make for a better court, I think. I think so, but at every level, you know, I think it would be much, much better. It looks like I prepared too much information today. We may have to continue this tomorrow night's show, because there's still plenty to talk about on this theory. I'd appreciate it if you join me tomorrow. I will be here again, same time, same bat channel at 9 p.m. in Missouri, and I'm very hell-bent on this and getting some more information out there for people to consider. So please join in and listen to me, and we will talk some more about it. You can follow the schedule for Damn Radio, which I suggest that you do, at damnradio.com/schedule. You can get our podcasts at /podcast. Tomorrow we have Shield Maidens of Missouri, A Really Big Shoe, Jack's Car Show, and international flavor. You can listen to us all, and I hope you do. You can download the app also and pay attention to that. You can also, after every show, I upload it to internationalflavor.com, and you can listen to mine there in addition to at the damn radio /podcasts. Thanks for coming.